Hello everyone, Ken and Louie here, back with more World of Tanks basics. And in this episode, we will take a look at common weak points that you should aim for when fighting enemy vehicles. So, you probably know that most vehicles have some kind of point in their armor that is weaker than the rest. And usually, there are at least two common places that you should shoot in order to have an easier time penetrating a vehicle, especially heavy tanks, since, they're known for their armor. So we're going to take a look at the Chinese Tier 10 113 as an example. So his armor, if he's facing straight at you without any angling whatsoever, his upper plate, this is called an upper glacis plate here, because it's the upper part where they get their name. So that is 240 millimeters of effective armor. So if you don't want to deal with that, where should you shoot? Well, usually most vehicles have some sort of lower plate weakness. So, just like the upper plate, it's basically just a plate that is lower on the vehicle. And in this case, if we take a collision model, it is actually technically the same thickness as the upper plate, but it is a lot less angled. So even though that is 120 millimeters of armor, it is only 165 millimeters thick of effective armor. And if you are a tier 8 vehicle, you will typically have over 200 millimeters of penetration. So in that case, you would be able to hit the lower plate of the 113 quite easily. So if he's behind a rock or rubble and he's hiding his lower plate, where else can you shoot? Well, there's commander's hatches, which are these two domes right here that are apparently 140 millimeters thick and are equivalent of 200 millimeters of armor in a lot of cases, sometimes 220, depending on exactly where your shell hits it. Usually these commander's hatches are rounded, so try to hit them as square on as you possibly can. And so you might be thinking, well, that's just on the 113, where else can I shoot on other high tier vehicles that I might be facing? Well, actually, most vehicles have the same weaknesses. Now, that might be not necessarily true for some of the newer ones that are some newer vehicles that are coming out, but let's take a look at the Super Conqueror. The Super Conqueror is the Tier 10 British heavy tank, and he has also a commander's hatch weak point, but there is kind of a catch with the Super Conqueror, though. You kind of have to shoot this flatter part right here with the viewport in order to penetrate it, because otherwise it is angled enough to be an auto ricochet, especially if he is using his gun depression. So if we look at his upper plate, it is 260 millimeters thick without him angling it at all. But his lower plate is actually very weak, with being 140 millimeters of effective armor. So if you're a tier 8 vehicle, you can actually penetrate this quite reliably as well, with roughly most tier 8 vehicles, I think, with their best guns have 180 to 220 millimeters of penetration. So you can go through this every single shot as long as he is not hiding it. Now, if he's hiding it and he's using his gun depression, you can't really shoot his commander's hatch weak point, but especially if you are above him, you can shoot his commander's hatch there, and in some cases you can actually shoot his roof armor. Like right here, if you were above him here, you could actually shoot him here on the roof of his armor there. The weakest part of a tank is actually their roof or the bottom of their vehicle. That's why if you splash under a vehicle with high explosive, you tend to do quite a bit of damage regardless, is because it's so weak on the bottom of a vehicle and the roof. So if you can get to a point where you are aiming down at the roof armor quite a bit, it is actually quite easy to penetrate. So those are the two most common weak points, is some kind of commander's hatch. Commander's hatches obviously take different forms depending on which vehicle it is, but for sure the lower plate weakness is easily the most noticeable and biggest target to hit. Some commander's hatches, like on the 113 and sometimes the Super Conqueror, are actually quite tricky to hit. So let's look at an example of something that doesn't have the lower plate weakness that is on most vehicles in the game. Well, the Object 268 version 4 that everybody claims is super overpowered is because it has a strong lower plate, when most vehicles in the game actually have this lower plate weakness of some sort. So his lower plate is 300 millimeters, or 350 effective if he's not even angling his armor. But he still has a commander's hatch or periscope weak point on top of, sort of on top of his vehicle anyway. And it is 250 millimeters thick, which is a lot thinner than 340 millimeters, that's for sure. And some cases, in this rare case, you can actually shoot his upper plate or lower plate if you are above him with quite easily, with a lot of ease. But usually, if commander's hatches, they don't look like domes, they will look like this periscope. Some periscopes that are in the game is like this Object 268 version 4, the normal Object 268 here also has a very, very weak, well, it's nowhere near the version 4, but it has 120 millimeters of effective armor on the periscope, making it really easy to penetrate. And his lower plate is 215 millimeters compared to 246 effective armor. And okay, I wasn't sure if Internet Explorer was dying on me or what, but yes, if commander's hatches, they don't look like domes, they will most often look like periscopes of some kind. The Object 268 version 4 has this, the Object 268 has this, the Foch 155 has this. So which vehicle, there is a few vehicles that do not have this periscope or commander's hatch weak point, which is the Object 430U with its 300 effective armor commander's hatches, which I do not actually agree with. I think they shouldn't be that thick, but they are. But it does have the traditional lower plate weakness, so I mean, at least it has that, right? Instead of his upper plate being 260 armor, you can penetrate this with 180 millimeters or higher penetration. Some vehicles, like the Super Heavies, the Mouse Tank is a good example. It does technically have a lower plate weakness, but it is still very thick. The weakest part of it is around 240 armor, depending on where your tank is and how you're positioned in comparison to the mouse because of angling. Because if he angles his armor, obviously it's a lot thicker than it is being straight on. So if he's straight on against you, it will be roughly 240 to 250 millimeters of armor, but he does not have, these periscopes right here do not actually damage the tank, and they are actually put into the model as 0 millimeters of armor. So the super heavy tanks, which are the Mouse, or at least the tier 10 ones, I should say, the Mouse and the Type 5 heavy tank, do not actually have a lower plate weakness. It is the same thickness as most of their armor. But the Type 5 heavy, or any other, well, yeah, most Japanese heavies do still have a commander's hatch. It's still very strong. And if I would equip the right gun on there, there we go. You can actually have a 50-50 chance of penetrating his commander's hatch. So that's kind of some exceptions to the rule. Most weak points, like I've said, are some kind of domes or periscopes. and lower plate weaknesses. The lower plate weakness, with the exception of the Object 268 version 4 and some of the British tank destroyers, are pretty much the only ones who do not have their lower plates are not technically weaknesses, and sometimes are actually the strong points of the vehicle. But for pretty much 90% of the vehicles, or any vehicle that has meaningful armor, it will have a lower plate weakness of some sort, and have a periscope or commander's hatch weak point on the top of the vehicle that is slightly weaker than the rest of the armor. The lower plate weakness, usually that is the place to shoot. It is a lot easier to hit and is a lot weaker than the commander's hatches. So those are a few common weaknesses of vehicles, especially higher tier vehicles in World of Tanks. And hopefully this episode of World of Tanks Basics helped you out in finding out where to actually shoot some of these heavily armored vehicles. So thank you very much for watching. Like I said, I really hope this video helped you find out where to shoot some of these vehicles if you are new to World of Tanks or have played some World of Tanks, but not necessarily to the extent of tier 8 through 10, where armor is definitely a lot higher in value and a lot trickier to deal with. Unless, of course, you dab the 2 key, but we're not. That is for another video. So thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.